Okay, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Andrew Nance, and I'm an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm speaking to you today from Denver, and I'll be hosting today's internal PSO class series on climate solutions beyond capitalism. We're really excited to share the second installment of the series today with you with the class titled Real Solutions to the Crisis. Next slide. This class is going to cover what is needed to cool the climate, from a shift in energy production and consumption to ecological restoration or carbon capture, linking indigenous knowledge of nature with scientific methods. I want to encourage everyone in this class today to join the remaining classes in the series. It's critically important that all comrades are able to explain in plain language what is going on with the environment and climate change, and why specifically the socialist reorganization of society is ultimately needed to save humanity. So the upcoming classes are How Capitalism is a Barrier on February 21st and Socialism for Our Survival on February 28th. We also want all comrades here to talk about these classes with others in your units or in your branch. Tell other comrades what you learn, encourage them to join, and talk about ways to fight against the destruction of our environment in your communities. The class series will be led by Tina Landis, author of the PSL book Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism. She is a founding member of the PSL, works in air quality and climate protection, and holds a certificate in sustainable management from the University of California, Berkeley. She writes on environmental and climate issues for Liberation News and is a frequent commentator on Sputnik News, as well as shows like By Any Means Necessary and Political Misfits. You can purchase the book online, and we're going to drop a link for that book right now in the chat. Purchase this book online. We highly recommend that all comrades get it and study the book. However, it's not required to attend these classes. If your local branch has not already held a branch-wide study of the book or a public event around it, it's highly encouraged. And if you would like to arrange for the author to join a local meeting about the book, please let your point person or your point of contact for the national department know, and we can try to arrange that. So before we begin the class, I just want to say a few things. Firstly, about Denver, all comrades know we are in a fierce battle to defend our comrades and the movement as a whole in Denver, Colorado. So make sure that you visit denverdefense.org and that you've watched the short documentary available there, which gives background about the struggle. If you have more questions about the Denver struggle, please contact your local leadership. Secondly, I want to make a pitch for all comrades to make sure you're keeping up with all party media. LiberationNews.org has expanded greatly in the past year with daily content and analysis. It's critical that comrades regularly read the articles posted onto the website. Additionally, please keep up with liberationschool.org and our women's magazine, Breaking the Chains, breakingthechainsmag.org, and on social media until the next issue is physically released. PSO members are hosts and regular speakers on podcasts like the Socialist Program with Brian Becker and the media group Breakthrough News. Both of these programs are putting out extremely important analysis that all comrades will benefit from. Lastly, before we start, I want to mention that we have an exciting lineup of classes coming out organized by our national leadership. If we could take a brief moment to just share the calendar. Excellent. So we're in the month of February now, and we are in the second class for the Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism. But next week, February 21st, we'll have the third class, as well as the beginning later in the evening of the public class series, Black Struggle is Class Struggle. And those classes will continue until the end of February on the 28th. And in March, we will be beginning a series titled Fascism and Global Class Struggle. The registration for that is open now, and it closes, I believe, February 19th, which is next Friday. And at the very end of the month, we'll be beginning Revolutionary Feminism in the Marxist Method class series. Both these classes are internal, and that Revolutionary Feminism and Marxist Method class will continue on through April and end in May, going every Tuesday. More information about this class will be coming out soon. And if you want to reference this calendar, you can be sure to look through your email. It was sent, I believe, last week. Okay. And if you have any additional questions about this content, you can reach out to your local leadership. And with that, we're going to go to the next slide. and I am going to sort of introduce our facilitator for this series, Tina Landis. As we mentioned before, Tina is going to be giving a presentation, and we'll be having time for Q&A afterwards, and also here and there throughout the class series. We want to make sure that we have a lot of participation from all of the attendees, so be sure to put any questions and comments into the chat, and we will get to the ones that we can with Tina, and any more questions and any more comments that we have will definitely enrich the discussion. So without further ado, welcome Tina.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, comrades, for joining today. So the objective of this class series is to share the facts about what we're facing and the concrete solutions that exist to climate change, and to give us the tools to educate our class and inspire hope and action, and also to shift the demands of the climate movement to the left, to call out capitalism as a culprit and socialism as the solution. Today's class will focus on what we can do to mitigate the effects and reverse climate change. Next slide. So there are two crucial things that need to happen to address climate change: draw down existing CO2 in the atmosphere and greatly reduce emissions. One without the other is not enough. Next slide. CO2 remains in the atmosphere for 100 to 150 years. Studies show that the committed warming from the legacy load of CO2 already in the atmosphere will cause temperatures to rise 2.5 to 2.8 degrees Celsius over the course of the next century or so. And that's if we cut all other emissions today. Staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming is what science shows as the threshold to avoid catastrophe. This is why it's crucial to draw down the CO2 that's already been emitted, as well as immediately shift to renewable energy. We must utilize biosequestration, meaning using plants and soil to capture carbon, which can cool the climate in just decades. This will greatly improve biodiversity and the overall health of the planet. Next slide. We need to go beyond sustainability to regenerative practices due to the immense damage already done to the environment. Reforestation and restoration of grasslands, mangrove swamps, wetlands, salt marshes, and ocean habitats aid in carbon capture. Next slide. Studies show that restoring 4.7 billion acres of previously forested lands on 5 continents with native species could capture 2/3 of all the carbon emitted since the Industrial Revolution. And you can see in the slide up top is what could be reforested that was previously forested. And 4.7 billion acres is, just to put it in perspective, is a slightly larger than Russia in land area. Next slide. Regenerative agriculture can also capture and store large amounts of carbon and at the same time build a food system that is healthy for humans and the planet. We must shift away from industrial agriculture, which is a huge drain on the ecosystem. Industrial methods release immense amounts of carbon into the atmosphere and just deplete soil and water resources from plowing, synthetic fertilizers, and chemical use. Industrial methods are at odds with nature rather than working with the planet's natural capacity to produce. Regenerative agriculture goes a step beyond permaculture and organic methods by eliminating the need for any inputs of fertilizer, irrigation, or chemicals, saving energy, water, and human labor. Now I want to show just a short 4-minute video that explains this process of carbon capture in the soil. You want to start at 7?
Soil is a living miracle. In one handful of soil, there are more organisms than there are humans on Earth. And we are only beginning to understand this vast network of beings right beneath our feet. We rely on healthy soil for 95% of what we eat. Yet we take it for granted. Thousands of years of plowing, deforestation, and erosion have left our soils in dire shape. And we're accelerating the loss of this essential resource. But there's a lot more to the story. When soil is damaged, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and this has had serious consequences for the climate. Too much carbon in the atmosphere is causing the Earth to overheat. That excess carbon is also acidifying our oceans, threatening marine life. Meanwhile, there's not enough carbon where it once was, in the soil. In fact, many of the world's cultivated soils have lost more than 50% of their original carbon stocks. But there's actually some good news. We now know how to put carbon back in the soil where it belongs. Plants capture carbon dioxide in their leaves and pump the carbon down through their roots to feed hungry microorganisms living in the soil. Now, what had been atmospheric carbon, a problem, becomes soil carbon, a solution. Practices like keeping soil covered with plants, increasing crop diversity, composting, and carefully planned grazing are proven ways to put carbon back into the soil. Carbon-rich soils act like giant sponges, absorbing water during floods and providing it to plants in times of drought. And adding carbon to soil makes the land much more productive. The French government recognizes this and is calling on all countries to join them in increasing soil carbon by 0.4% each year. If every nation were to reach this ambitious but achievable goal, we could store 75% of global annual greenhouse gas emissions, enough to make a real difference to our planet's future well-being. Of course, we still need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions, but we don't need to develop expensive or risky technologies. Instead, what we need is a lot more photosynthesis. Climate change can be overwhelming, yet there is real hope. Healthy soil can be a major sink for carbon. But this fact hasn't been well known until now. Because now we know a soil solution is right beneath our feet.
You could go to the next slide. So it's a myth that we can't feed the world without industrial agriculture, chemicals, and GMOs. Hunger is the result of distribution, storage, and access, not the capacity of the earth to produce enough food. The diversity of food crops and cover crops restore soil nutrients, greatly improve water and soil retention, and work together to ward off pests. Eliminating plowing keeps carbon in the soil and retains a healthy microbiome, producing higher yields than industrial methods at lower costs to farmers. Soil health can be restored in just one growing season, and the shift can create microclimates with lower air temperatures and higher humidity. Small farmers are already shifting to these methods across the US and globally to escape indebtedness to chemical and GMO companies and to stop poisoning themselves and their communities. Big agribusiness controls the majority of industry under capitalism, unfortunately. Regenerative livestock grazing, I think you can go to the next slide. Yeah. Regenerative livestock grazing and the restoration of grasslands is another key to cooling the climate. 60 million buffalo once roamed the Great Plains until colonizers slaughtered them as a tactic to force native populations into submission. Grazing herds are a key component to a healthy grassland ecosystem and the natural carbon cycle. Today, 70% of agricultural land in the US is used to grow corn, soy, and hay to feed livestock in industrial feedlots and factory farms. Next slide. Instead, we need to restore the grasslands and graze the livestock on those lands. This would shift current practices from being a major greenhouse gas emitter to one that captures carbon and restores biodiversity, water resources, and soil health. The natural forage that grasslands provide is healthier and easier for animals to digest, greatly reducing methane emissions. It also eliminates the need to collect more manure in waste ponds like they do in industrial feedlots that releases methane into the atmosphere. Instead, animal droppings are scattered over grassland areas, acting as a nutrient-rich fertilizer for the soil. Next slide. The Lowest Plateau, an early agricultural area in China, had become desertified, leaving farmers in the region destitute. In 1994, the Chinese government began the process of restoring the land, and by 2009 had returned an area the size of Belgium to a productive and biodiverse ecosystem, bringing 2.5 million people of the region out of poverty. This proves that restoring the soil can happen in a very short time frame and on a very large scale when resources are put into it. Now I want to show another video about the work of agroecologist Ernst Gosch in Brazil that restored depleted land through what he terms syntropic agriculture, which is another term for regenerative. It's 15 minutes, but I think it's helpful to see how this work is really done and showing the practices that can be implemented actually on large-scale farms.
Quem viveu numa terra como essa, e a gente perder, é um trauma. A gente perder isso. Entende o que eu quero dizer?
You know, as you're going over the rainforest in a plane, you look down and you can imagine all this diversity, the morpho butterflies and the parrots.
Claro, não tem nenhum que teria sumido, nenhuma cultura, nenhuma civilização pelo mesmo motivo, esgotamento dos recursos. E a gente está repetindo.
Se a gente mudasse um pouco o olhar e olhasse para a natureza como uma grande aliada e uma grande inspiradora, eu acho que a gente iria mudar muita coisa do nosso jeito de lidar com o planeta.
E a gente sabe que uma das atividades mais agressivas para o meio ambiente é a agricultura. Mas já existe conhecimento e tecnologia para fazer diferente.
Para mim, agrofloresta é isso, sistemas que são inspirados na natureza.
To me, that's truly taking the rainforest as a model, right? The structure of the rainforest grants the function of abundance, really.
And this is not so well known. Agroecology is a major tool in fighting climate change.
A ciência vem avançando muito na interpretação do conceito agroflorestal de maneira integral. A gente pode pensar a agrofloresta com qualquer tipo de arranjo ou de combinação do componente florestal com o componente agrícola, com o componente pecuário.
Há uns 10 anos atrás não existiam muitos filmes sobre a agrofloresta e a gente resolveu buscar modelos para filmar e para aprender também. Dentre as muitas experiências brilhantes que a gente viu por aí, uma chamou muito a nossa atenção, foi a agricultura sintrópica do Ernst Gosch.
Viver de floresta, produzir alimentos na floresta, com floresta, posso mostrar que funciona.
A sintropia, ao contrário da entropia, é um processo que vai do simples para o complexo. E a agricultura do Ernst segue essa lógica. Todas as interações ali são no sentido de promover um balanço energético positivo no sistema.
Uma das características do Ernst é que por trás da prática agrícola dele existe um conjunto de pensamentos muito sofisticado. É um conhecimento científico profundo aliado a uma inteligência, a uma sensibilidade prática de uma pessoa que faz agricultura desde os 3 anos de idade.
E ele conseguiu sistematizar tudo isso de uma forma que os princípios pudessem ser replicados em qualquer lugar, independentemente do solo, do clima, do tamanho da propriedade.
A gente buscou alguns exemplos. Em Brasília, a gente conheceu o João e o Romo, 2 alunos do Ernest que estão disseminando um modelo de cultivo intensivo de hortas e florestas partindo de solo degradado.
Hoje, quando a gente olha o sítio deles, parece um pequeno oásis no meio de uma região que já foi muito degradada por práticas de agromineração, pelo fogo.
Então a gente tem que procurar um sistema para restaurar os ambientes que funcione, e que produza e que retorne, porque sustentabilidade tem que ser econômico, social e ambiental.
O foco do nosso trabalho aqui é recuperação de solo com produção de hortaliça e futuramente fruta, né?
A sucessão vegetativa com o espaçamento e a ocupação dos andares no tempo, e aí a poda das árvores, a poda das bananeiras, a poda das fruteiras. Esse trabalho da poda, de trazer o material para baixo o tempo todo, é o grande barato do trabalho do Ernesto, que eu nunca vi por aí.
O que a gente precisa é adequar tanto a questão do cultivo, ou seja, agronômico, para que a gente possa realmente produzir alimento, recuperar o solo, atender a demanda do mercado e que a gente possa ser feliz. A ideia é essa.
A gente já está aqui com 2 anos e meio. Esse sistema ele já tem a própria matéria orgânica dele só com as podas daqui. Eu já não preciso mais trazer matéria orgânica de fora, se eu não quiser. Não é uma perda de energia. Quando eu uso adubo aqui, eu não estou jogando fora. Ao contrário da agricultura convencional, seja orgânica ou não. Quando a gente aduba aqui, a gente pega 1 e transforma em 500. A gente não. A agrofloresta transforma. 1 em 500. Na agricultura convencional, seja orgânica ou não, a gente põe 1 e daqui a pouco tem 0,3. E daqui a pouco tem que botar 2, não mais 1. Né? Porque a gente não está trabalhando com a vida, com os processos da vida. Então aqui a gente usa o mecanismo floresta, que é o motor que gira e faz o planeta respirar e viver na agrofloresta.
No momento que eu colher aqui, o solo vai estar melhor do que ele estava antes.
Esse é o meu sonho. Vamos plantar floresta e vamos manejar a floresta, mostrando que o caminho para a floresta produz alimento e a floresta produz alimento.
E dentro disso eu me encantei com esse mundo de possibilidades de fazer ecologia na prática e não só da boca para fora. O grande barato é realmente as grandes possibilidades que tem, porque quando você entende como funciona a sucessão natural vegetativa e coloca a produção de alimento nesse formato, que é a tecnologia natural que o planeta usa, a gente entra no mecanismo, numa sincronicidade com o planeta. Então, esse é o trabalho do Ernesto. Ele entendeu como funciona a floresta e ele coloca, então, a produção de alimento para funcionar na engrenagem do planeta. Esse é o trabalho da abundância, para a gente chegar num estado de abundância.
Me confirma, estou no caminho certo. Trabalhar para criarmos áreas de inclusão permanente e não áreas de proteção permanente do ser humano. A AIP. E essa aqui seria um começo de uma AIP.
Outra experiência, agora num contexto completamente diferente, é a de um empresário que está enfrentando o desafio da grande escala no interior de São Paulo. Lá a gente encontrou uma fazenda de orgânicos, estruturada como empresa, que encampou um projeto de pesquisa aplicada em sistemas biodiversos adaptados para grandes áreas.
A gente vê desse lado aqui, né? A gente fez um plantio aqui orgânico de madeira sem investir em matéria orgânica no solo, né? Isso que o Ernest desenvolveu das leiras, né? E a gente vê uma diferença enorme. Esse sistema aqui tem uns 6 meses a mais que esse daqui e esse daqui está muito mais bonito, mesmo mais jovem.
Você observa que o projeto está montado em solos com muita areia, solos muito sensíveis à degradação.
Quando eu falei para o Ernest que eu comprei essa terra aqui, eu falei, mas lá a terra ruim, arenosa. Ele falou, não tem terra ruim. E olha o que a gente está conseguindo fazer aqui em 1 ano e meio, é incrível.
Você está vendo, né? Não é mais areia, senão ela tem uma bem clara estrutura.
Isso, para quem trabalha com solo, é fascinante.
I have studied agroecology, or regenerative agriculture, as it is also called, for many years. And I also visited some farms and some gardens and some fields. But here at Fazenda da Toca, I saw it for the first time on a large scale, and I was extremely impressed.
A gente sabe hoje que os grandes desafios aí ambientais, econômicos, eles são em grande escala. Então nós precisamos buscar soluções em grande escala também.
E já faz 7 anos que a agricultura sintrópica vem sendo adaptada para grandes áreas.
Os princípios são os mesmos. O desafio é colocar isso numa forma para ser mecanizada.
Está fechando aqui uma coisa que eu e o Ernest já estamos trabalhando há muito tempo.
Como essa é uma agricultura que é baseada em processos e não em insumos, é justamente o desenho e o manejo que substituem a adubação e até mesmo a irrigação.
Então não me fica mais caro que o outro com o herbicida. Mas vou ter a grande vantagem de criar vida e não matar vida. Aqui a diferença é muito grande, porque isso se reflete depois no estruturamento do solo, na fertilidade do solo, na capacidade de retenção de água.
Eu acho que isso que o Ernest traz de melhor, porque ele consegue pensar de uma forma muito clara de transformar o inimigo, aqui no caso a braquiária, em alguém que está colaborando com o sistema.
Não explorando recursos, potencializando, sintrópico.
Para o Ernest, a poda é como se fosse o combustível das transformações. É ela que coloca o metabolismo do sistema para funcionar no máximo da eficiência, num aumento constante de recursos. E esse é um dos princípios da sintropia.
A poda da árvore tem vários efeitos. Por um lado, ela vai aumentar as atividades nas raízes e ela muda, naquele momento, a micorriza. Como um dos subprodutos desse novo metabolismo são ácidos giberélicos para crescimento. O novo crescimento faz com que a planta, em simbioses ativas, bem ativa e forte, com bactérias e fungos que disponibilizam alimentos para eles. Então, isso dá um efeito de como se fosse a adubação do campo, tudo. E agora o terceiro efeito ainda para a planta, taxa fotossintética mais alta do que a não podada, mais fotossíntese. Na realidade é mais carbono fixado em hidrocarbono e é mais raios solares usados, seja esfriando o ambiente. Esfriando o ambiente, você tem mais água.
Porque essa é uma grande notícia, né? Porque, vamos inventar a máquina para sequestrar carbono. Não, cara, a gente já tem um sistema produtivo fantástico que já sequestra um monte de carbono, né? E além disso, produz alimento, produz madeira, produz o que a gente quiser, cria biodiversidade, dá dignidade para o trabalhador rural.
Eu acho que aqui tem um caminho extraordinário. Porque se pegar um executivo de uma grande empresa dessa e ele vier aqui na Fazenda da Toca e for lá e falar assim, poxa, ele está usando máquina, ele está plantando eucalipto. Puxa, estou plantando eucalipto, né? Então, isso pode dar um curto-circuito benéfico. Dá um boot no sistema, dá um boot nos paradigmas, dá um boot nas crenças, que são crenças muitas vezes sem reflexão, sem ponderação.
Eu fiquei muito impressionada porque eu vivo da agricultura, eu vendo, eu preciso vender, porque se eu não vender eu não vivo. Só que eu não tinha visto como seria possível fazer isso sem ser esse pacote que é vendido pra gente. E no curso eu vi que é possível.
Na verdade, estão acontecendo coisas aqui que eu nem nos meus melhores sonhos eu imaginava que iam acontecer.
Tem um pensamento que não é só pensamento, não é só ideológico, ele está acontecendo, a gente viu, né? A gente está vendo.
Que a gente traga práticas regenerativas, que não só sustentem, mas que gerem esse impacto positivo.
E aqui você está encontrando uma possibilidade de fazer um cartão de visita. Essa fazenda aqui é um cartão de visita. Aí você tira e fala assim, ó, Fazenda da Toca, é possível.
Se com pouco tempo os meninos de Brasília e a Fazenda da Toca perceberam melhoras, imagina um lugar que recebe esse manejo há 40 anos.
Quando nós adquirimos ela em 1984, encontrei aquele lugar como fazenda fugidos da terra seca, desmatado por completo pelo dono anterior, que era dono de serraria. Os maiores problemas que eu tive no início era água, seco e vento. E aí comecei a plantar, trabalhando a dinâmica da sucessão natural. Agora, a mudança definitiva do lugar chegou uns anos mais tarde. Na medida que aquelas árvores cresceram, comecei a ralhar e depois fazendo poda. Aquele foi aqui no português, ou seja, em português brasileiro fala-se o pulo de gato. Mudou tudo.
Já são 500 hectares reflorestados. Hoje, a fazenda do Ernest é considerada um dos fragmentos mais férteis e biodiversos da Mata Atlântica.
Com o trabalho que eu fiz de reflorestamento, a temperatura na fazenda é mais baixa, assim, o clima mudou fortemente. Os solos mudaram por completo.
Em 2015 foi a primeira vez que a gente conseguiu captar umas imagens aéreas da fazenda do Ernest. E foi muito impressionante, porque a gente vê aquela florestona toda lá embaixo e mal consegue conceber que ali é uma área agrícola altamente produtiva. E que, inclusive, dali sai um dos melhores e mais caros cacaus do mundo.
Nos últimos anos, a dinâmica da floresta começou a radiar para fora, assim com que a microrregião está sendo influenciada, está aumentando cada vez mais as chuvas, porque no núcleo, na fazenda, está chovendo. Hoje em dia, agora, todos os 17 córregos têm água o ano inteiro, mesmo nos tempos mais secos. O ser humano podia se reconciliar com o planeta e ver o que possa fazer para ser útil, para ser querido. Só que a gente não percebe, ou seja, não enxerga, por termos desligado da vida no planeta, achando que nós somos os inteligentes e não vendo que somos parte de um sistema inteligente.
So we'll share the link to that in the chat so you can watch it later. Again, it was a little choppy. I think some of the subtitles were hard to read because it is choppy. Now we'll have time for some questions on any of the content I covered so far. And Esteban, you can, go to the next slide. It's fine.
So if people have questions, we have gotten a couple, but if you want to drop a few in the chat now, that would be very helpful. Let's try to refrain from actually using the Q&A function. It's a little confusing for myself. So this first question is, there's a country in Central Africa that had a massive reforestation project, and they were wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, Tina.
You're probably referring to the Great Green Wall in Africa, which is a project. It's like multi-country project that is building reforesting areas in the Sahel region, which borders the Sahara Desert, basically stem the spread of the desert southward. So it's a partnership between many countries building that wall. I think they're at 15% of their goal right now, and it's really helping. It's helping agriculture production too, because it's regreening these areas that are becoming just desertified. But you could Google it, Great Green Wall, Africa. There's a lot of information online. It was sort of modeled after the Great Green Wall that's also happening in China. They've been working on for decades now, for the same reason, to stem the spread of the desert.
Excellent. We have two more. This next one says, is there any way to amend heavy compacted clay soils without plowing or breaking them up?
There is another, maybe I can put it in the chat. There's an earlier regenerative agriculture practitioner called Masanobu Fukuoka. He was in Japan. He passed away a few years ago. He did a lot of work in the 70s and onward. And he has a whole process of reseeding the desert and greening the desert by using these like clay balls that have seeds inside them. So basically, and you can do aerial seedings of huge areas and drop them out of airplanes, and they'll actually grow with very little, because there's moisture in those clay balls as well as nutrients. And it can grow anywhere, really. So I invite you to read more of his stuff. I'll put that in the chat too. But, and then the plants and the trees and whatever's growing will draw up underground water. It will help bring the water table closer to the surface. And then from there, the plants and the microbiome in the soil does the rest.
Excellent. Okay, we have a few more here. This next one says, is regenerative farming or foresting getting traction politically in the United States or anywhere else globally?
Yes, it is. There's organizations, I mean, less so by government, although there is, if you watch, someone I put in the chat, and I think I told Andrew to put the link, there's this longer film called Kiss the Ground that's on Netflix. It's really great, and it talks to farmers around the US who are shifting to regenerative agriculture. And there's actually a subsect of the Department of Agriculture that works specifically on soil science, and one of their people is really pushing regenerative agriculture and going around the country and trying to work with farmers to make these shifts. Of course, like I said, big agribusiness is harder to shift, but small farmers are really looking into this. And I know in the Bay Area, San Francisco, I'm in San Francisco Bay Area, and there's lots of this work being done at UC Davis, by Sacramento, and all over Marin County, Sonoma County. There's a lot of farmers making these shifts already, and a lot of research going into how to do it better and all the carbon capture benefits from it.
Okay, so we've gotten a few questions here. I'm just going to take two more. This next one is, why does pruning help the soil? Is it because the trees then focus on the roots?
I'm not an agroecologist myself, so I'm not sure the exact science, but yeah, when you prune it, it activates the root systems, and just activates growth and basically wakes up the plant, to be even more. It activates photosynthesis more and things like that. So it sort of keeps the plant like doing its job, as opposed to like sort of as it grows, lessening its carbon capture capacity.
Excellent. Okay, so we will have time at the latter part of the class to address or we'll try to make time for the latter part to address these questions we weren't able to get to now. But for the last question for this section is there a point of no return for soil recovery?
I mean, there was that problem, if topsoil completely blows away, which is what happened in the Dust Bowl, right, in the 30s, it's harder to recover. I think that, we're not at that point globally where there's like no hope of turning back, but it does need to be addressed, because over time it just degrades more and more.
Okay, thank you, Tina. So again, we'll have time for more questions throughout the presentation and more at the end. Let's continue with the presentation.
The name of the natural farmer who seeds the desert. He has lots of great books. You can just Google his name, you'll find lots of resources. Next slide. Plexus Park is a project in the Mammoth Steppe in Siberia that is reintroducing large grazing herds to the region to help keep permafrost intact. As animals graze, they make the snow more compact, which keeps the ground colder and prevents melting. Studies also show that when the animals push away the snow to reach the grass underneath, the permafrost that's exposed to the air stays colder due to the lack of insulating snow. So it's sort of a dual effect that's happening. The grasslands are fertilized by the grazers, making the ecosystem more productive at pulling carbon from the atmosphere than through the large trees that took over these grasslands when the traditional grazing herds were lost. And there's another video, this is the last one. It's just 3 minutes and it goes into this more. It's a pretty interesting project.
Hello, my name is Nikita Zimov. I am the director of the Plexus Park. Here in the Siberian Arctic, permafrost under my feet is starting to melt. This frozen black mud contains twice as much carbon as the Earth's atmosphere. And soon carbon will be released as carbon dioxide and methane. Powerful greenhouse gases that cause our planet to warm more, cause even more permafrost to melt.
Видите, чем опасно глобальное потепление? Можно сгореть.
There is only one theoretical chance to prevent that from happening. We must restore the Ice Age Mammoth Steppe ecosystem. In places where permafrost is eroded, we often discover bones of animals. These are remains of the lost ecosystem. During the Ice Age, millions of animals roamed this territory. At the end of the last Ice Age, prehistoric human hunters drove these animals extinct. And now, it's our obligation to bring back this ecosystem. This ecosystem has the capacity to slow the climate warming and cool the permafrost, and thus protect it from melting.
So when animals trample down the snow, they actually thin their layer of snow, making it dense, and this allows much deeper freezing during winter. So animals actually making permafrost much colder and keeping this huge carbon reservoir, which is now under our feet, intact.
Plexus Park was founded as the scientific experiment by my father, Sergei Zimov, over 20 years ago. Most of my father's and later my life, we dedicated doing research on permafrost, global warming, and polar ecosystems. We introduced several animal species which successfully transformed the landscape into steppes. Our research has been published in top peer-reviewed journals, including Science, Nature, Geophysical Research Letters, PLOS ONE, and others. With the money we raised from this campaign, we will buy a small herd of bison near the city of Perm in European Russia, plus a herd of yaks in the Republic of Tuva. We will then use a heavy-duty trucks to transport them to one of the farthest points a road reaches on the Eurasian continent. From there, animals will be loaded on a barge and transferred down the Koloma River to the Plexus Park. We've been hearing talks about global warming for decades, but still, problem gets only worse. In place where I live, changes become evident to everybody. We are rapidly approaching tipping point when warming becomes unstoppable. It is too late to wait for someone else to deal with it. We must take actions now. If you want to join our efforts, please support this Kickstarter campaign.
Give it the next slide. So in addition to all that I talked about, we also need to end wildland encroachment and deforestation to support biodiversity and reduce stresses on the ecosystem. The rise of the suburbs that began after World War II has had an extremely detrimental impact on ecosystems, as well as a major increase in emissions from the car culture that arose at that time. We must end suburban sprawl and development in wildland-urban interfaces, which increases fire risk in drier regions. Reintroducing controlled burns aids in reducing wildfire spread, but human activity in high fire-prone areas always raises fire risk. A spark from a lawnmower or a chain dragging behind a vehicle can start a fire. Houses and other buildings tend to be highly combustible, which causes fires to spread faster than in areas without these structures. Next slide. Mycelium, whose fruit are mushrooms, is a key component of a healthy forest ecosystem, acting as a communication and resource sharing network. Modern forestry practices destroy this network through monoculture tree farms and fungicides that are sprayed between plantings. Mushrooms are a very effective tool for restoring polluted land and can remove heavy metals, radioactive materials, and other toxins from soil and water in a very short time frame, leaving behind no toxins in their bodies. These methods are much more effective and lower cost than traditional bioremediation methods and restore soil within weeks. Another fungal spore has shown to improve the health of honeybees and counter colony collapse disorder, which is largely the result of monoculture agriculture and pesticide use. Other spores are effective pest control for carpenter ants and malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Next slide. In the fight against climate change, we must build partnerships with Indigenous communities. The rise of capitalism and displacement of peoples through colonization broke our connections to the land and our deep knowledge of ecology. Indigenous peoples are 5% of the global population, with 80% of global biodiversity existing on their lands. Indigenous communities hold an ancestral knowledge of the local ecology and living in alignment with nature, and must be partners and advisors in climate change mitigation. Indigenous communities have a legacy of regenerative agriculture and grazing practices and sustainable land management and prescribed burning that aids in wildfire prevention, carbon capture, and building healthy biodiverse ecosystems. Now we have short time for questions on any of that last section I covered.
Yes, so we have one in the chat here. And again, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat now as we have entered this next section. This question says, is there actually a tipping point, a point in the near future where destruction of all humanity will be inevitable?
No one knows for sure, but the UN Climate Report in 2018 gave us 12 years to greatly reduce emissions, to avert this runaway scenario where it's going to be beyond reversing. So that is sort of the scientific community. That's their take on it, and I agree. We should get moving if we're going to survive. Because at a certain point, there'll be so much warming in the atmosphere, no matter how many trees we plant, and even if we cut all our emissions, that will already be in the atmosphere and warming, continue to warm.
Excellent. Okay, and we actually have a few questions left over about kind of like soil and regenerative methods. Do you want to address those now too? Would you prefer to wait till the end?
See, let's wait till the end because because I have a lot of other stuff to cover, and there'll be might be lots of questions from there. We're already almost at 1 o'clock.
No worries. Yeah. So it looks like we just have.
We'll definitely try to answer them at the end.
Okay. So there's another question here about Indigenous communities. This is, how do we partner with Indigenous communities?
There's an organization I recently been looking at. It's called the Indigenous Environmental Network, and they're connecting tribal leaders and others around the country who are working mainly against the fossil fuel expansion, like against pipelines and drilling from basically the Arctic all through the US and Canada as well. So that's one organization I've been looking at. But yeah, I mean, the comrades who are in areas where there are tribal nations who are doing, environmental work, we should try to make connections and reach out to them. I mean, really, it's going to be up to all of us in our areas, in our local areas.
Excellent. Okay, so those are all the questions we have for this section.
Okay. Next slide. So we're talking now about ocean restoration. The oceans are the largest carbon sink, sequestering more carbon from the atmosphere than all the forests combined. There are many projects happening around the globe to aid in ocean restoration, which can increase the carbon capture capacity of the oceans, lower acidification, and increase biodiversity. Industrial fishing methods must shift to sustainable practices. Increasing the number of marine protected areas can allow for species to rebound. This also increases fish populations in the waters surrounding the protected areas, improving local catches. Coral nurseries in Cuba are addressing reefs that are becoming damaged by increasingly strong hurricanes by regrowing corals and planting them back on the reef. Those are in the slide, you can see there's little pieces of staghorn coral that they're growing on these like PVC trees under the water. And then once they get to a certain size and health, then they go and plant them back. They reattach them to the reef. Supercorals that have been discovered in Australia, and research out of the University of Miami into heat-resistant algae can help corals survive bleaching events. Next slide. Kelp is the fastest growing tree on the planet, growing up to 2 feet per day. Marine permaculture arrays that create kilometer-scale kelp forests can help rebuild ocean habitats and simultaneously aid in restoring cold ocean upwellings that bring nutrient-rich waters from the depths. Ocean restoration can also reduce acidification and balance carbon capture. Seagrasses, kelp forests, and shell beds can reduce acidification by pulling CO2 from the water in high acidity hotspots. Next slide. Wetland and reef system restoration can stem the effects of sea level rise. The San Francisco Bay Area Shoreline Adaptation Atlas, published in 2019, lays out a comprehensive plan to address sea level rise in the densely populated Bay Area, which has 400 miles of vulnerable shoreline. The plan, which can be replicated in other regions, shows how reefs, seagrass beds, and marsh systems can be utilized to absorb rising waters and storm surge to protect coasts. But no action has been taken by local governments to implement this plan, despite the looming crisis. Next slide. There's also the problem of plastics in our oceans. The Ocean Cleanup Project has designed a passive flotation system that works with wind and wave action and can remove plastics from millimeters in size to large debris like ghost nets. If fully deployed, it could capture 90% of ocean plastics by 2040. Now we have another section for questions on the ocean restoration. And for those who missed the first class, I did go into a lot into the problems, the bleaching and all, the coral bleaching and all that. But I'm happy to go into that again if people have questions.
Okay, again, if you'd like us to address one of your questions, you can put it in the chat now. We have one that says, can you talk about the recent oil spill in the San Francisco Bay?
I mean, it's fairly small. And it was contained pretty fast. It was we have a lot of refineries here in the Bay Area. And it was the Chevron refinery had some sort of upset and oil leaked out. I don't know exactly how much, but it was fairly small. And it was contained quickly. I don't know the latest status of it though. That was last weekend, I believe it happened.
Okay. The next one says, how quick does coral grow back?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors probably because different types of coral grow faster, and also the local conditions, the acidification of the water in that region, or the water temperatures. But it can grow fairly quickly. I mean, because they're microscopic little creatures, and they all build these corals together. So it can happen fast, or at least getting to a healthy place can happen quickly.
Okay. Another question here is asking about how to deal with the plastics that are recovered from the ocean after they've been captured in nets.
I'm sorry, someone was sending me a message. Can you repeat it?
Of course, yeah. It's what is the plan to deal with plastics recovered from the ocean after they've been captured in nets?
Right. I mean, that's a whole other problem, which I'm going to go into later in this class, that we just need to reduce waste dramatically because most of the plastic is not ever recycled. I think it's only like 10% of plastic has ever been recycled since recycling began. So, yeah, I mean, I assume that's what they'll try to repurpose it. They're not going to throw it back in some place where it will wash back into the waterways, but it is a problem.
Okay, excellent. So I think that concludes it for this section. I see some other questions that we'll try to address at the end.
Okay, next slide. So along with all those restoration efforts that I mentioned, we also must drastically cut CO2 and GHG emissions and shift to renewable energy. Studies show that the technology exists to immediately shift to wind, water, and solar energy production and meet global energy needs. Geothermal, tidal, and wave energy are largely untapped renewable sources that have great potential. Next slide. New research out of England is developing less environmentally impactful hydropower that can utilize gravity in hilly regions to generate electricity by creating underground water systems. Some of you may have seen the film Planet of the Humans. It was on Netflix for a while. I personally don't like it because it doesn't pose any solutions and leaves the viewer feeling like we're doomed to rely on fossil fuels. But it does point out an important fact that due to limited supply of rare earth minerals used in solar panels and the current lack of ability to recycle those panels, plus the carbon footprint needed to build all the renewable infrastructure, we must also greatly reduce our energy consumption so that we don't need to replicate the current power system, the capacity of the current power system. I think you can switch to the next slide. Yeah. Existing homes and buildings need to be retrofitted and appliances replaced with energy efficient ones. Worldwide, buildings account for 32% of energy use and 19% of energy-related greenhouse gases. In the US, energy consumption of buildings is 40% of the nation's total energy consumption. And almost 80% of the energy used in these buildings is wasted through poor insulation and electronics and lights left on unnecessarily. Next slide. Cuba's 2007 energy revolution distributed rice cookers, pressure cookers, and energy efficient refrigerators to every household and became the first nation to completely eliminate the use of inefficient incandescent light bulbs. Through socialist planning, much could be accomplished to greatly reduce energy use by systematically retrofitting homes and replacing appliances regardless of the occupant's income. If you see on the slide, those last two figures are dramatically different. The per capita energy consumption between US and Cuba and the per capita emissions. It's amazing. So, but that's because of socialism, because you're only using what is needed, you're not wasting. Next slide. Net zero buildings are buildings that produce and consume equal amounts of energy. And another step beyond are zero water and zero waste buildings. You can switch to the next slide. And these buildings harvest rainwater and process waste on site into compost. All new construction could be built this way and greatly reduce energy needs. But under capitalism, this building model is only implemented by sustainable-minded, wealthy individuals and well-funded institutions. Now we have time for questions again. Is there any clarifying questions?
Yeah, so I don't think that I noticed any coming through that latest section, but again, if people have questions, they can type them in now. I'm seeing one that asks, can you point to some resources for those looking to start a farm?
Farmers, maybe Andrew, you could type this in, Farmers Footprint. If you just Google it, they have a website and it provides resources to farmers, information, connects farmers to each other. You can see what others are doing. It's a really good resource. And I think they're working with farmers all across the US.
I think this question is also sort of about sort of sustainable living. It says incandescent light bulbs may be less efficient than fluorescent ones, but don't they have the problem of poisonous mercury in them?
Yes, there is that problem. LEDs, I believe, are the best at this point, but the good thing about fluorescents is they last for a very, very long time. And hopefully we can get to the point where we can recycle them safely. I know actually in San Francisco, we have a recycling program for them, or at least a safe disposal mechanism. But yeah, hopefully as technology advances, we will find even better, safer lighting.
Excellent. Okay, so those are all of the questions that have come up in this section.
Okay.
Let's proceed.
Next slide. So in addition to another way to reduce energy consumption is to greatly, reduce production, eliminate unnecessary production, which would reduce energy needs as well as material extraction and waste. 40% of food is wasted in the US. Most of that food ends up in landfills and accounts for 34% of methane emissions as it decomposes. Greatly reducing food waste that took energy and water resources to produce and composting of the food scraps can eliminate those emissions and reduce energy needs while producing biological nutrients that can be used to restore depleted soil. Next slide. We must also make things to last and implement cradle-to-cradle production, which means all the elements in a product either biodegrade or can be endlessly recycled for reuse. Next slide. Eco-cities are being built in China today, and Singapore and many other cities are incorporating green spaces and green walls and roofs into architecture. Next slide. An eco-city is a human settlement modeled on the self-sustaining resilient structure and function of natural ecosystems. Incorporating green spaces and native trees and plants into urban areas and into buildings themselves can reverse the detrimental impact cities have on the ecosystem by capturing carbon, cooling air temperatures, increasing water tables and biodiversity, and improving air quality and the physical and mental health of the human inhabitants. Next slide. Energy needs could be greatly reduced by shifting from cities built around car usage to walkable, bikeable cities with all services provided within close proximity. Through socialist planning, we could all work and recreate near to where we live instead of commuting long distances every day to work. Zero emission public transit and high-speed rail could connect urban areas to other cities and rural areas. An electric vehicle car sharing system could be established in remote areas where public transit was not practical. Next slide. There are solutions to mitigate and even reverse climate change, and through socialist planning, these solutions can be efficiently and comprehensively implemented to benefit all of society. When we're talking to people in the movement or in our personal lives about climate change, it's crucial that we convey at least the basic solutions, right? So reducing CO2 that's already been emitted by using plants and soil, shift to renewables, and reduce our energy needs. Those three things are really key to the solution. And that's it. We'll move on to questions.
Okay, so we have one question that was from that section you went over. I believe it was in regards to sort of the eco buildings or eco cities presentations. And it says, how will all of these changes make a difference if the corporations and factories don't stop their use of fossil fuels?
Right. I mean, it needs to be, it all needs to, these are all components that all need to happen, right? We need to move to eco-cities. We need to build our buildings to be, zero net energy. We need to shift our agriculture. We need to reforest, and we need to cut emissions from, vehicles to factories, all the emissions from landfills, all these things need to happen. That's what I'll talk about in the next class, is how capitalism is a barrier to allowing that to happen because of the system of profits and no overall organized plan for society.
Okay. So this next question is, under a socialist government, how will we keep oil industry and corporations at large responsible for their hand in the destruction?
Yeah, I mean, the finances of these big oil companies should be seized and used to build the renewable infrastructure. I'll talk about this more next time, but I mean, these oil companies have known for decades what they were doing was causing climate change or causing global warming, and ignored it. because they want to keep making profits. Even to this day, they want to keep making profits in the last bits of oil they can dig out of the ground.
That's true. Okay, so I know that we have some questions that we want to pose to the participants here. So perhaps we can go on to the next slide and get into those.
Next slide, 7.
Great. Okay, so this first question says, can you describe some ways that nature captures carbon from the atmospheres? And you can kind of drop your answers in the chat. See, one response says soil. Another is photosynthesis. Okay, plants breathe it in and store it in the soil. That's good. Kelp, coral reefs, biodiversity, oceans. Plants capture from the air and can move it down into the soil again. Okay, oceans capture carbon, healthy ocean organisms, indeed. Permafrost traps it. Grasslands, okay. All right, those are the responses there.
This is all good.
Okay, so this next one says, what are some ways we can reduce energy needs? A socialist revolution, I think that's the top answer there. Less commuting. Let's see. Reducing production by turning off lights that you don't need when you use them. Energy efficient appliances. Reducing suburbanization. Stop wasting so much food. Let's see. Moving away from traditional industrial agriculture. Better organizations of our food systems. Okay. Not wasting it like the corporations do. And we have recycling, better planned cities, trying to be as zero waste as possible, retrofitting existing buildings to be more efficient, better home insulation, better urban layouts so people live where they shop and work, ending the wars, reducing overproduction, dismantling the military. Okay.
Definitely a key part of it.
Mm-hmm. We have essential planning of production. It's all very good. Build all new buildings efficiently. Recycling heat from wastewater.
Mm-hmm.
Invest in rail travel. Okay, I think those are all the unique answers. See a lot of the same ideas are being put in, which is good that we're on similar fronts. Okay, so this next slide asks the question, what ecological restoration projects could happen or are happening in your region? Okay, reforestation.
Maybe you could also put where you live when you.
Yes, that's good.
I'd like to know where these are happening.
Yeah, wetland preservation. You said someone wishes that they could kick out all the oil and gas companies in New Mexico. I wish you could do that too. Food forest in public areas. Okay, here they come. Coastal restoration near Boston. Wetland restoration in Oregon. Okay, prairie restoration in Chicago. Nuclear cleanup in Albuquerque. Wetland restoration in Michigan. Control prescribed burning in Colorado. Turning more private properties into protected forest in New England. St. John River is insanely polluted and one of the biggest rivers in states. Okay. Grasslands and marsh restoration in Quad Cities. Okay, we have here Niagara Falls. For many years, people have been using hydroelectric energy. I live in Buffalo, New York, which is about 20 miles from Niagara Falls. Okay. In Oakland, let's see, in Oakland, significant wetland restoration projects around the estuary and Lake Merritt needs to be done on a larger scale, however. Okay. Tree planting in Boston to combat the urban heat islands. Texas suffers from droughts. There's a need to focus on restoring soil health through regenerative agriculture. Through the oil companies out of the Gulf of Mexico and from the shores of Alabama. Okay, Texas, they could stop the fracking and return the valley to Indigenous and Latinx farmers to restore biodiversity. And Utah, reforestation by planting more trees and biodiversity. Okay. Below the Falls, project enrichment to study and protect our estuary. Okay, reintroduction of native plants and species in Boston. Okay. Okay, we're seeing there's a project in DC to separate the sewer from the storm drain system so it doesn't overflow into the Anacostia River and massively pollute it, which kills most life in the Anacostia and Potomac nearby. Okay. Expand public transportation and make it free in San Francisco. We have stopping universities and biotech companies from producing a massive amount of chemical waste in Boston. Some really great answers, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, riverbanks being restored, but the gentrification process, the beautification projects, stopping coal energy to produce electricity in San Antonio. University at Buffalo is doing solar energy projects.
Yeah, these are all great to hear about. It's so important that we are aware of what's happening, solutions that are happening in different places in the country and the world, because all you hear about is the bad stuff, right?
Indeed, I think there's a few more that I can read off. I believe, so this says the tribes are no longer relying on BIA for land management, so prescribed burns are being planned in Oregon. It says cleaning up Superfund sites in New York City. Restoring native plant life is much needed in San Diego. Okay. So thank you all for contributing these answers. And I think we're going to go into a more general Q&A session. So if you have any questions that we didn't get to answer or that you have now, we have a stack though from throughout the class, and I'll just start with, how do you aerate the soil without breaking it up?
Yeah, so healthy soil, all those little creatures are aerating the soil for us, really, when you have healthy soil. But there's also, like, if you watch the film Kiss the Ground that I mentioned, there's this machine that, like, basically when they're planting seeds, that doesn't plow the soil but digs little, like, grooves in the soil just for so the seeds can sit there. That may also aerate the soil a bit. But I invite you to watch that film. I think it has even more, goes really into depth about the process.
Right, and I just dropped the link to that in the chat there. Okay, this next question says that they mentioned the regenerative agricultural process is applicable everywhere. Is there a good place to learn about how this process might be applied to areas where we live?
Yeah, like that, what I mentioned before, Farmer's Footprint, they have a lot of resources on there. And if they don't have something for your area, you could definitely reach out to them and they could connect you.
Okay. This next one says, how does the mainstream regenerative movement interact with the movement for Indigenous self-determination? And how can we keep that central in our work?
Yeah, I mean, so regenerative agriculture is really what Indigenous communities have always practiced. So they definitely are connected. A lot of the farmers who are there's a farm just south of San Francisco that's, partnership with the local indigenous tribe. So a lot of these small farmers are partnering with the local indigenous communities. A lot of these farms are led by indigenous communities. So yeah, they're very much integral.
Okay. This next question says, how does, that is, sorry, the question that I just asked. This next one says, we've seen contradictions between development and indigenous sovereignty in Ecuador, for example. Is this a contradiction that is just a symptom of developing countries having to survive and produce in the capitalist world? Or is exploitation of resources a necessary part of developing the economy in some nations and regions?
Yeah, so I'll go into this more a bit in the next class when we talk about capitalism and imperialism and how it relates to climate solutions. But yeah, so, and a lot of people on the left criticize the global south for, like Venezuela having to use oil to fund all the social services, and there are contradictions. But yeah, these developing nations are struggling to get to sustainable energy production. And that's because of the legacy of colonialism and imperialism that's kept them indebted to the global north and, struggling just to develop in general. I know in Bolivia too, there were some contradictions between the indigenous community and the miners, and different programs that Morales had started. But yeah, it's just part of the process because of the legacy of colonialism.
Okay. This next one says, how has the Fukushima disaster harmed the environment?
Yeah, so if comrades aren't familiar with it, it was, I forget what year now, many years ago, 2015 maybe, when the earthquake and tsunami destroyed the Fukushima reactors, and yeah, there's massive, there's a meltdown, and all this radioactive waste for years was leaking into the ocean. It's really hard to pinpoint exactly the ramifications. They were finding radioactive isotopes in kelp and different sea creatures off the coast of the Western US that, because of the currents, were bringing the radiation over here. Definitely major human health impacts for sure. It's unclear about the ramifications on marine life. But yeah, definitely not a good thing. We need to move away from nuclear, which I'll talk about more next week as well.
Okay, this next one says, what do you think about the balance between the necessary actions we'll need to take to prevent the worst effects of climate change and the strands on the left that have a negative gut reaction against trying to mess with ecological systems? When folks say there's productive industry can do, it plays into a sense of inaction that benefits the ruling class.
I'm not sure what this question is getting at. If it's talking about geoengineering, geoengineering I do feel is very bad and very risky and is not needed, actually. It's really, I feel it's a way for these wealthy entrepreneurs to make money off of the crisis and sell their solution.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all I have to say. Unless there's
and if the person who asked that question, if they want to try to rephrase it in the chat, they're welcome to. So this next one says, it's about the 40% food waste statistic. It's asking where that one came from.
I've seen that on a number of sources. I could look in my if you get the copy of my book, it's very well sourced. But yeah, I've read that a number of times in various studies. And it's really, a lot of it, the majority of it comes from commercial food waste. So grocery stores, restaurants, they're throwing food away more so than an individual household. It's just, they throw away food if it has and the producers, right? If fruit or vegetables have just a slight imperfection, it's tossed, even though it's still good, you know? So most of that waste comes from the production system or the distribution system.
Okay, we just have a few more questions here. This next one is also about that statistic. It says the 40% wasting of food is one of the worst aspects of all of this to me. People are going hungry each day for no reason at all. The billionaires say it's the most productive system, but capitalism is actually the most wasteful. How can we explain this to people?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about it more in next class as well, but you know, just pointing out that restaurants and grocery stores literally lock their dumpsters so that people who are hungry can't get the food for free that they've thrown out, right? I mean, just that nugget of truth is so damning to the system. Like, you are so obsessed with profits that you're gonna let people go hungry when the food is literally right there. I think that's a really good way to make the point.
Okay, this next one says, what do you think about the shift to electric vehicles by the auto companies?
Yeah, that's another thing I'll go into more next class, but there literally aren't enough rare earth minerals for the batteries in electric vehicles to replace every internal combustion engine on the planet. And it's not the way to go. Like I said, we need to rebuild our cities so they're not based on cars, because that is not sustainable to continue our, you know, mass commuting and all that, and all of us having our individual vehicles. It's really, you know, it's a tool of capitalism to, you know, be green and also make a lot of money. You know, Elon Musk is now the richest person on the planet due to his, you know, the electric vehicles and Space Force and all that. But it's not needed, and it's not sustainable in the long term, actually.
That's good. Okay, so there's one that says, how does water insecurity figure into all of this?
Yeah, that's a big, big concern. And like I said, through all this, you know, restoration of lands and reforestation and shifting our agriculture, we can improve our water resources. It pulls groundwater up from really deep, trees do especially. So it can replenish the resources of water. But we also need to save, we need to not waste water. I mean, here in San Francisco, we get our water from snow melt up in Yosemite, like in the mountains. And it's a combined system. So it's used, you know, to flush our toilets. We have this pristine water we're using to flush our toilets. So that all needs to revamped and made sustainable as well. And also, like, but the capitalists, I don't want to divulge too much, I'm going to talk about next week, but the capitalists, you know, they just started selling water futures on the stock market because they see that there's going to be shortages and they want to make a profit off of betting on these shortages, right? I mean, it's just a very sick cycle. And the whole water bottling industry and all that is also incredibly wasteful and just trying to control scarce resources and that we're all going to be fighting over later.
Okay, so we have two more questions and then we're going to wrap up. This next one is, it says, isn't the US one of the biggest contributors to fossil fuels?
Yeah, I mean, the US is, just the US military is the biggest consumer of fossil fuels on the planet. And oil is very much tied to the US dollar. If you see it, I'll show a slide next time. If you track it over time, the price of oil and the value of the dollar go hand in hand every step of the way for a long time now. So it's very integral to the whole capitalist system of, especially of the US. And it's in or used to make almost every product we buy. It's used to produce our food, right? The fuel in the tractors, the transport to get the food around, the products, a lot of the products have petrochemicals in them, you know. So it's really, yeah, it's very integral and they don't want to give it up.
Okay, thank you. And this last question says, do you see the necessary shift from individualist environmentalism towards systemic change as a part of the movement towards socialism?
So you mean like, yeah, I wish we could have a back and forth. I mean, individual actions are, we should all try to conserve more and not be wasteful, but really it's systemic. It's the system of production that we live under with capitalism that needs to shift to really resolve climate change and to really move to a sustainable or regenerative system. Whereas individual actions are not enough because the majority of energy that's used, emissions that are created, resources that are used up happen in the production system itself, as opposed to on the individual consumer level. If that makes sense. I'm not sure if that fully addressed what you were asking. But.
Yeah, I believe there's actually a follow-up question that says, or could you talk about the capitalist individualist environmental movement?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, so much of it is the shaming of others. Like, you should be buying, you should be driving an electric vehicle. You should be not flying. You should be vegan. You should, blaming others for the problem. And it really it also comes from a place of privilege. That narrative of the environmental movement. Not everyone in the environmental movement has that narrative, but it's really not seeing the systemic problem, and it's really not seeing the working class issue of like people don't have a choice but to drive their gas powered car to get to work. Like, they really don't have any other choice because there isn't public transit, because they can't afford an electric vehicle, because they're working 3 jobs and they're just trying to feed their family. Like, they can't afford to buy organic and vegan and green products and all this. So it is a problem in the environmental movement, and it should not be this blaming individuals for the problem. It's really toxic and a big problem and very divisive. Okay. And I think really keeps the greater working class from getting involved in this crucial issue that everyone knows is a problem, right? But it's, you don't feel welcome sometimes. So.
Okay, thank you so much. So that's all the time that we have for today's class. I want to thank all the comrades for joining. I know that there were some of you that kind of got kicked out and rejoined and no longer have access to the chat. So I'm going to drop some of the links that we shared throughout the class in right now for you to take a look at later. And if you're interested in hearing more in-depth analysis about the topics covered today, can we go to the next slide, please? The upcoming class is next Sunday, and it's titled How Capitalism is a Barrier. And we also have another class on the 28th at the same time. Again, that's 12 p.m. Pacific and 3 p.m. Eastern. Please be sure to join us. Lastly, you can purchase the book online, right? It's not required, but we highly encourage everyone to read and become familiar with it. And I believe that's all we have for today. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. And
yeah.
Bye.